Hello again. Welcome to my third installment in the series on how schools in Colorado were funded. In this particular installment, we're going to take up what was left from last time. So part one was an overview down in the description. Part two was how we talked about how much the state says individual school districts are required to fund, right? How much on a per pupil basis do individual districts need to give in order to give what the state would term an adequate education, right? Or a good education. In part three, that's today, we're going to talk about how it is that the state makes up for lack of local funding in order to meet that target amount. Or said another way, today will be called the state backfilling lost local revenue is not just because they're nice people. All right, so let's do some pictures here. Now I have some good news for you. This particular part should be shorter and less intense mathematically than part two was. If you zoned out on part two, shame on you, but I can understand. Part two was a ton of math, right? And some people don't need that amount of detail. This one ought to be fairly shorter. Okay? All right. Here is the idea. The state comes up with the amount that local school districts need on a per district basis to fund what the state would call an adequate education, right? Now I'm going to represent that by two circles here on the page. And again, I'm going to go with my fictional districts, Denver District and Logan District, because Logan's where I live and Denver's where I used to live, and they're two relatively different cases. Now, the size of these circles might be different, and if you want more detail on that, go back and see part two. But these circles represent the full amount on a per pupil basis that these districts must pay. Now, this one here might be, say, $91, and this one here might be $95 per student, but each of these is the full amount. Now, let's talk about how this actually works. Once the state sets this number, it is up to individual local districts to pay as much as they can. Okay? Now, let's say Denver is going to pay this shaded amount right here, and Logan County is going to pay this shaded amount right here. Okay? That's how much these school districts have to pay. It's not like this is how much they're choosing to pay. This is how much they can pay. They go to the state and say, this is how much I can give. Now, you'll notice that Denver is able to, they're able to kick in a little bit more than Logan is. Denver's a bigger district. Maybe Denver has more what's called property wealth. And if you ever wonder about that, go drive through the Park Hill neighborhood in Denver. You'll see exactly what property wealth means. They have a more wealthy tax base from which to pull property taxes, which is the main source of funding. So Denver's got more than Logan County does. Now here's the thing. As I mentioned in the last video, our state runs on what would be called an equalized funding basis. Now that means that the state has said, if one district is short, we're going to make up that amount in order to get to what we have termed the adequate amount of funding for that district. Okay? In other words, the state, symbolized here in blue, is going to come in and fill in the hole to make each district up to the point where they are what the state has deemed an adequate amount of funding. Now, already you can probably see the answer to what I put at the beginning. The state being concerned about local tax revenues and a fall off in local tax revenues is not just because they're nice. As you can see here, they have a financial stake in the process. If Logan County, for some reason, decided that their tax revenue fell, or that they couldn't fund it due to choices of voters, lost revenue, what have you, guess what? State's got to fill that in. So it isn't always out of the kindness of their hearts that the state is concerned about local revenue. If you see or read about how the state's going to have to backfill local revenue, it's because it's required by law. Nobody has any choice here in the matter. All right, now, the state filling in the hole left by local taxes kind of leads to some natural questions, and I wrote those down. Now, if you have specific questions that didn't occur to me when I was writing up my notes for this, please add them to the comments, send me a message. I'd be happy to either write you a response, or if it was something that I thought would be worthy or enough people asked it, I would just make another video. The first question is, how much of the share tends to be given locally, and to how much of the state share is made up by the state, and how much locally? First, let's go back a quick step, okay? Because this is not a minor thing. If I was to graph funding versus time, what you'd see is that the state share, it's not necessarily a straight line, it's kind of craggy, but over time, since about 2000, the state share has been going up, right? So we are putting more money per pupil into our schools from the state as time has gone on. Interestingly enough, the local share, which I'll do here in blue, started out bigger, but sometime early 90s, I believe, these two crossed. And what you found was, through a goodly portion of the 90s, the local share stayed pretty well fixed, and then it too started to rise. Although, at any given year, you'll note that the gap is growing. So we are spending more on education in this state. Our state is spending more on education in this state. Local government is spending more on education in this state. And the state, on a per pupil basis, is spending more than the state does. In other words, they're growing faster. Okay? Now, in terms of percentages, for this last year that we were in, roughly, our state made up about 59% of the school's revenue, while local districts brought up 41% of that revenue. Okay? On average. Some were bigger, some were smaller, but on average, fiscal year, I believe it was 21-22, it's in the school funding handout, which is also linked below. That's been the resource I've been using a lot for these videos. Local is 41% on average, state was 59%. So it isn't like the local district is just chipping in a little bit and the state's chipping in a lot. It's been growing, and a little bit 60-40 at this point. Okay? All right. Now, what about another question? Another good question that you might be asked is does this money ever have to be earmarked? In other words, I'm going to put Logan back up here. If this circle represents Logan, when the state pays in, or when the state tells Logan what to do they say, give this much here to chalk and other supplies, give this much to physical plant, right? Give this much to teachers and in the classroom, etc., etc., etc. Do they earmark money? Turns out that used to be the case. The state and local governments used to say, you will put this much here and this much here and this much here. But a recent law has changed that, and now it's kind of a free-for-all. Right now we have in this state, just you get this much money between state and local, and you spend it on whatever things you want. It's kind of been a bone of a contention for some, but that's the way the law sits right now. Okay? Another question is, what happens if, here's my local government, like here's Logan, they've got this much, and the state says, oh, sorry folks, we only brought in so much money, we can only give Logan that much, right? If the state doesn't have the money, they don't have the money. They can't pay it in there, right? If you need this shortfall made up somehow, you got to figure out how to ask that, and we'll come back to that in a second. But if the state is short on money, they're short on money, you just don't get it. What the state will do is they'll proportionately remove from everybody. So there would be a circle here for Denver where Denver got shorted, sort of in the same proportion. But they always do the calculation in such a way that the states, and this I hope would make sense, the state's never going to come back in and say, well, we're going to take out all of this, which included some of the money that you originally had for you. We're going to eat into you a little. The state will never do that. Okay? All right. Another question, what would happen if there was a district that was rich enough that they actually earned more than the state required? So, I don't know. I'm going to make this up. I don't know this for sure. Let's say this was Aspen, and here is Aspen's local share of what the state says is required. And Aspen is wealthy enough. We got this little bulge over here, so Aspen actually has extra money beyond what the state requires. Okay? There are a few things that the state can do in that particular case. Okay? Now, again, if you want, what you're going to see from me here is a gross oversimplification. If you want more detail on this, School Finance Handbook, start on page 18. Okay? Now, they're going to get this minimum amount. If you have extra money, guess what the state requires, though? The state says you will fund this circle fully. If you have more money, this bulge out here, guess what the state's going to have you do? The state is going to ask you to pay back some of the money. In other words, you're going to have to buy back some of the money that it might give you for special projects. Like if the state gives you, say, a little bit of money for special ed or gifted and talented, and you've already filled your circle, you're going to pay this back to the state. You're going to give them their money back, and it's called a categorical buyback. Okay? So you have to give money back to the state. In other words, you're going to have to buy back some of the assistance they gave you. All right? Another last little niblet before we call it a day on this video. What would you do if you were an enterprising local school district and you said to yourself, you know what? I'd like to make more money than I'm making right now, and I want to have even more money put toward the school. Now, because the state and the local finances are sort of somewhat intertwined with each other, you're going to have to actually figure out certain criteria for that money. Okay, let me check my notes here. School districts are allowed, and this wasn't always the case, this is a law change, to raise additional money that everybody agrees on ahead of time is not going to be part of the equalization. So let me symbolize that for you. Here is what the state says you have to have. Here is this, and here is the state's share. If you get to here, and both the state and everybody else agrees, you're going to earn a little bit of extra money to, I don't know, pay for, say, some enrichment program that the school doesn't require you to do. It's okay if you earn that little bit extra money, provided none of that money would have gone here. So if you're going to do this for a special program, doesn't interfere, doesn't interact, isn't part of this circle at all, you can do that. What else can you do? You can use extra money to pay back prior bonds. If you as a school, in order to finance something like this, or in order to finance, say, some new construction or a purchase, if you issued bonds, you can ask for extra money from your local voters to pay that back. You can use it to pay for transportation. So if you updated and bought a bunch of new buses, you can ask for extra money and do that. And it's not going to cost, or you're not going to have to pay it back, because it doesn't interact with this little wedge here. Okay? One last little niblet. Governor Polis's pet project to fund all-day kindergarten. You are allowed to help fund that and not have to pay that back if you raise extra money locally. Okay? All right. So I hope now it makes a little bit more sense why the state is always so nervous about doing things that interact with, say, property taxes. Property taxes have been in the news a lot lately. And when the state talks about it, they're always talking about, oh, well, local governments can't take a hit. They can't take a hit. And it's not just because the state's looking out for the interest of local governments. The state is making sure that they don't have to make up a revenue shortfall because they would be on the hook. If property taxes took a hit, said again, if I lost property taxes back to here, guess what's going to happen? Somebody from the state's going to have to pay this. Okay? Now, one last thing. There is somewhat of an incentive structure here for, if you're a local district, for you to figure out ways to do this. There's all kinds of dodges that the state has written rules and laws about in order to prevent local districts from doing that. Because again, it isn't just the state that can play games. Local governments can play games too. They can mess around with how students are counted, when students are counted, which students are counted, etc., etc., etc. In order to say, well, we only owe 1.4 million. We don't owe 1.5. So the state's going to have to make that up. There are all kinds of games. There are all kinds of rules that the state has about that. Okay? There's rules about how much the local government has to do for property tax. There are rules about student counting, right? There's all kinds of rules that are meant to interrupt that incentive structure, which would say, if the state makes up the difference, I'm going to pay less. Okay? All right. Hopefully you found it helpful. As always, questions, comments, feedback, good or bad, put it in the comments, send me a message. See you in part 4.